it's right perhaps that we all send our congratulations to the Leader of the Opposition, Gary Lineker, and to know that the governing party, both the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and the Deputy Prime Minister Keir Starmer, are facing an enormous public backlash, which I expect to grow even bigger when people get on the terraces for today's games. And that's an illustration of a very important fact, really, because I'm sure I don't need to repeat to this audience the fact that the mainstream media is overwhelmingly in the hands of people who support the political status quo, who support the divide between the rich and the poor, who continue to marginalise and exclude working class and labour movement voices from the media. And that, of course, is the reason why an independent media, an independent workers' press, rooted in the left, rooted in the wider trade union movement, is absolutely essential. And certainly in the Assange campaigns, there have been very long periods where Julian Assange was demonised by the mainstream media exclusively and without any single defender in the mainstream media. And it was only the left press and social media commentators that continued to defend him. And that was a crucial thing to do for a very simple reason. Because Julian Assange is spending now his 4th year in the high security prison at Belmarsh for doing one thing and one thing only. Now, these are the only things that he's being charged with by the United States, the only things that he's being sought to be extradited to the United States to face Espionage Act charges on. Those things are to tell the truth about the Iraq War, the Afghan War, and the structure of Guantanamo Bay and international diplomacy. He simply told you things which the government and the corporations in this country do not want you to hear. And really, when it comes down to it, there are only two sorts of news. There are government handouts, corporation press releases, and then there's the material that they don't want you to hear. And unless you want to have a media which exclusively, and we're too near to this already in the mainstream media, which exclusively retails to you the press handouts of the already powerful in government and in commerce, then you must be a supporter of an independent media and of the whistleblowers and organisations like WikiLeaks, which tell you things which would otherwise be hidden from view. And it seems to me there has been no argument, there is certainly no argument from the United States, that what Julian Assange did was in the public interest. They simply tried to redefine it as espionage. This is the core of the United States case. It was the case put by Mike Pompeo when he was director of the CIA, when he said that WikiLeaks is a hostile, non-state intelligence organisation. That's why in an unprecedented power grab, the United States is using its 1917 Espionage Act against a foreign citizen who wasn't even in America when those articles were published, to try and prosecute him in America. And that is an incredibly dangerous situation for the media generally. And my union, the National Union of Journalists, is absolutely clear that it opposes the extradition of Julian Assange because of the threat that such a move, redefining journalism, redefining investigative journalism as spying, would have on the entirety of the media. Working people have their own experiences of life, their own experiences of what it is to go to the NHS, or to be on public transport, or to live life at work. And from that different experience, they construct a different view of the way in which the society works. Society always looks different from the cottage than it does from the castle. And it is that elementary resistance in the minds of working people, perhaps never always thought out, perhaps not ever completed as an ideology, but it is the soil from which we in the left-wing media can begin to shape an oppositional culture and shape the mainstream media so that it in part represents that culture.
When we look at social media, since 2016, the algorithms have changed. All the companies have stopped us getting our message out there. Facebook has changed the way it does things. Elon Musk is talking about how he wants two kind of bubbles, a right-wing bubble and a left-wing bubble, and no one else will get to see any of this stuff. We have alternatives such as Owen Jones, Novara Media, George Galloway, who get maybe at most 1 million for a video that they would put out, which would be the top number of views. But how many people live in the country? I mean, is that really going to change anything? When we look at how the mainstream media behaves, when we have our own representatives on there, all we see are stitch-ups. We see Jeremy Corbyn's example, totally stitched up all the time. Every time he's on any show, they find some angle to undermine him. His allies have all been stitched up. The anti-Semitism smears that have been pushed on fantastic comrades like Ken Livingstone, Mark Wadsworth, Jackie Walker, Chris Williamson. These people have been destroyed by the media. We've not the Andrew Marr show. We've built up a regular audience, nearly 500 people every week. And they're not all the same 500 either, by the way. And on this show, we do parodies of mainstream media. We do the newspaper review. We did Countdown with Jewish Voice for Labour. We did Desert Island Disc with Jeremy Corbyn picking his favourite tunes. We did Jeremy Corbyn's favourite Arsenal goals. We did, we can be more entertaining in the way we do our media. We don't have to be too preachy. We can make things fun, and also we can educate people in different ways. Now, I think a collaboration is what we need between all of those media groups on the alternative media on the left. They all have to collaborate and build a big daily YouTube channel or a channel on a platform that might not be taken down by YouTube. So this might sound ambitious, and I've tried to pursue it, but there are lots of people who want to keep things as they are, and they're only getting a small amount of coverage. We have to push for a platform where we can get right across the country to different audiences, with different age groups, entertaining shows, different people presenting them. And I think this is the only way forward, and we have to think about it and focus on it. But I'm going to finish by saying that one of my favourite political heroes, other than Tony Benn, was George Lansbury. There's a book called The Miracle of Fleet Street, which is about how the Daily Herald started. And if you look at this paragraph here, early in 1911, there was a strike and lockout of printers. In London, they were demanding a 50-hour week to lead to 48. The men were very determined, while the masters, led by Joseph Causton and the Daily News, were equally obstinate in their resistance. As usual during strikes, the press grossly misinformed the public as to what the struggle was about. And in order to controvert the lies that were poured out every day, the strike committee decided to bring out the Daily Herald. So they just brought out something on that whim of that strike early in 1911. And that paper became a massive tabloid that eventually was soaked up and became The Sun, unfortunately. But it had a readership of millions and millions of people all over the country. And I don't see how we can't. If they had nothing to start with in 1911, why can't we start now to think about building a TV channel that will counter all the lies and misinformation that we get from the mainstream media?
So last year I actually went on strike in the charity sector. It's one of the biggest strikes in our charity's history. And because of the resolve of the members, we won a significant pay award that would mean that workers could turn the heating on this winter. And that wasn't an accident, because of the situation we find ourselves in. The cost of living crisis has pushed workers to their absolute limit. And so people have finally said enough is enough. But what we did experience while we were on strike was a concerted attack in the media, deliberate attempts to inflate the wages that we were paid, to misinform the public about why we were going on strike, what our jobs actually were, and to try and misdirect people. And where have we seen that before? We've seen it with the RMT and the attempt to demonise Mick Lynch. We've seen it with the CWU, whose workers have shown the most incredible resolve in standing up to their employers over months of losing wages in the winter. And we saw it with the nurses after the Tories kind of posed outside for them, clapping on their doorsteps, but won't give them a pay rise. And so what the Tories are doing is responding to a cost of living crisis with a new wave of attacks on workers, but also a new wave of attacks on refugees and asylum seekers, trying to incite hate and racism within our communities and trying to divide our class. And so it's up to us to respond to that with a bigger wave of solidarity through strikes, through anti-racist organising, but of course, as we've talked about today, through building a media that is not a mouthpiece for a racist Tory party agenda, but is a megaphone for working class people in this country. But there is so much work for us to do. Within the charity sector, we've got a huge amount of work to do to organise across all of these charities where workers are being exploited, but also we need to fight back against these media attacks, and that's why building left media is so important, to amplify our stories and share the struggle that we're going through. I don't want to dwell on the Labour Party too long because we could be here a while. But we've seen how quickly Keir Starmer is willing to row back from standing in solidarity with striking workers, because he wants to be seen as part of the establishment, he wants to be seen as new management, right? And apparently workers, not someone you want to be stood next to, despite making up most of the country. But there are near constant attacks on workers in this country and on the Labour left. And it's a really sad reality for us that we can't count on Labour leadership to take up our cause proudly when they're speaking in the public eye. So it's up to us to build that Labour movement, it's up to us to stand up for workers, it's up to us to speak out against injustices, and we need to support left media that's willing to tell those stories and willing to fight back on the clampdown on our voices and our right to speak out.
My union, the NEU, has faced a sustained attack from the mainstream media. I'm sure you have seen these attacks, and which have particularly ramped up in the past year or so since we announced our ballot for strike action. And some of the most recent examples of those were Mary Bousted was quoted as Bolshevik Bousted and Communist Courtney. And then also recently, Daniel Kebede has been quoted as being a hard left candidate for the NEU General Secretary election. And actually, most recently, Kevin and Mary were attacked by one of the mainstream media outlets for going on holiday during half term. Who would have thought it? Teachers having a holiday. And actually, Kevin himself responded to that and said that he was actually in meetings constantly while he was away. He was on Zoom calls, he was answering emails, and actually they don't really get much of a holiday. They're working constantly, as are most trade unionists. But the mainstream media don't seem to acknowledge that or understand that. I'm not a particularly famous trade unionist, but even myself, I've appeared in the Daily Mail because I attended a union delegation to Cuba, which was actually in 2018 and was a life-changing experience. But then, because they're obviously digging around trying to, get some dirt on these terrible teachers who are out on strike, there was a photo that was published less than a month ago in the Daily Mail saying that we were on a junket to Cuba, wasting members' money, having parties out in Cuba, which I'm sure you can all agree that absolutely is not the case when we go on union delegations anywhere, but in particularly to Cuba, we're going there to learn from other trade unionists, to show solidarity. And actually, as an educator, I learned a lot about myself and a lot about the kind of teacher that I want to be by visiting Cuba. I was thinking about why do they hate teacher unions so much, and I think that the biggest reason is because we provide an alternative vision of what education should look like. And I'm really passionate about early years education. I teach reception, and I really believe powerfully that children learn best when they're happy, when they are supported to be individuals, and when they're able to learn through play. But what the government want is for children as young as 4 to be tested when they first start school. There's testing in primary schools. In almost every year group in primary schools, children are tested, and these tests are high-stakes tests that essentially, if schools don't get the results that are required, then they're going to, they'll have falling roles, and it has a huge impact. And actually what the NEU does is present an alternative and says to our members, this is not how it has to be, there is another way. And the mainstream media hate us for that, because they're in the pockets of the government, and what they want to present is, well, actually what they want from education is conformists, and they want children to fall in line, and they want children to tick all the boxes that they've got. And we know as educators that children don't fit into these neat little boxes, and so the NEU is very proud that we stand against that. And almost every year at our annual conference, motions are presented that offer that alternative and argue for a better education system. So of course they hate us. And they also hate us because we have built collective organisation in our workplaces. The biggest demonstration of our power was January 2021, when we closed schools across the UK because they weren't safe to open, and the government were just not able to admit that they weren't safe. But through our collective power as local officers, as reps in workplaces, through that huge Zoom call that Kevin and Mary did on the Sunday, we had thousands of members going or refusing to go to school, handing in letters saying, I'm not coming in because it's not safe. And the only reason that happened was the collective power that the NEU stood up and showed. And as such a big union, we were able to do that. And obviously during COVID and during this current pay campaign, our membership has increased, and we have had, during COVID actually, we recruited 4,500 new reps. And during this pay ballot, we have recruited 50,000 new members since the announcement of our It's really important as educators that we stand up against this, and we fight this misrepresentation that we have in our mainstream media. And so we need to work for an alternative. We need media that represents workers. We need a workers' media. And obviously we don't have to invent this from scratch, because we already have it. It exists within the Morning Star and its predecessor, the Daily Worker, that have been representing workers' voices for the past 93 years. And standing by working people and putting across our views and our voices in this sea of hostile media. And so it's our job as trade unionists to promote the Morning Star and to help build our union membership and the Morning Star readership.
I started with looking at this BBC revolt over Gary Lineker's comments, and I think it's really interesting to see whether this will be an example of overreach by the Tory party in trying to silence criticism, because if it is, it comes after a period of increasingly brazen political interference. Now, I'm not one of the people who would say, as the BBC says, that it's an impartial broadcaster. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But I think from a socialist perspective, the BBC has never been impartial, and the idea that Gary Lineker has somehow breached impartiality that is otherwise observed by the BBC is complete nonsense. But what we have seen in recent years is an increasingly party political interference by the Tory party in the BBC. And we know, of course, the scandals around Boris Johnson and giving the chairmanship of the BBC to a guy who helped him out with a loan, who, whether that was connected or not, was a previous major financial donor to the Conservative Party. The director of the BBC is a Conservative Party politician, or was a Conservative Party politician before he took that role. And of course, the BBC was almost very directly threatened under the Johnson government because it criticised his refusal to go on the Daily Politics for an interview with all the party leaders in 2019. There was actually a direct threat from Number 10 that we will cut your funding in revenge for this alleged pro-Labour bias, which nobody could possibly have spotted got pro-Labour bias in 2019 from the broadcaster. So it would be good news if this revolt turns into a broader challenge to that tendency to politically control the BBC. But we're at a very, very dangerous point for the media in Britain. It's becoming rapidly less pluralistic even than it was. Censorship is on the rise, and this is part of a broader rollback of democratic rights across the board. The control of political narratives by the ruling class is one of the biggest obstacles that we face as socialists. And we've obviously seen all that in the last few years with Corbynism, and Crispin was giving a few examples of that, but we saw during that period a relentless, concerted media onslaught against the Labour Party and its leader, misrepresenting him, really blatant kind of manipulation, like the editing of an interview with Jeremy Corbyn to make it seem as if he'd said something he hadn't, which, of course, Laura Koonsberg had to, I don't think she did apologise, but the BBC had to issue a statement admitting that she had inappropriately edited that interview to mislead people. There were things like the photographs of him by the cenotaph trying to pretend that he was dancing at the Senate, really kind of ludicrous media attacks. And we had 5 years of this day in, day out to undermine the actual socialist opposition. And the Jeremy Corbyn phenomenon, I think, is important to us now, because there's a quote that I often come up with at these media talks, which is from a book called Reasons to be Cheerful by Mark Steele, in which he says the first things you learn as a teenager starting to go on left-wing demos are that the police aren't neutral and the press isn't fair. And I think that's something that most of us who are active on the left probably did clock quite quickly, that when you're brought up at school to think Britain is a liberal democracy with a free press that holds power to account and a neutral police force that upholds the law and so on, you soon start to see through those myths when you're actually taking part in left-wing politics. But now we have a huge, whether it's a movement still or an ex-movement or a dissipated movement, but we have a large number of people who did get involved in socialist politics for a few years, thank you, who have seen this weaponisation of the media and the state against that socialist politics. And it's, I think, the job of all of us who are part of the left media to try to build on that, to say, look, now all these people have woken up to the reality here. We need to build that into support for an alternative workers' media. The control of the media by the ruling class, even though people say they don't trust the media, they're right not to trust the media, it does have a massive effect on public opinion. Even if you say you don't necessarily believe every single story that you read, the actual themes that the media covers day in, day out will even subconsciously affect what we think are important. We see it at the moment with the refugee crisis. And Crispin, he was talking about the individuals whose lives have been destroyed by media assault, and I think it's very important to remember those people and to show kind of solidarity with those people. But of course, in recent weeks, we've seen, because of this demonisation of refugees by the Tory party and the media, actual far-right mobilisations trying to intimidate asylum seekers in hotels, really people in an extremely vulnerable situation have fled from horrific situations in other countries being targeted and hounded because of the media. And while Rishi Sunak is absolutely wrong to say this is the British people's priority, stopping the boats and so on, he's trying to distract people from the cost of living crisis, from the NHS crisis, from all of these other crises. It is true, if you ask people in opinion polls what are the big issues, that immigration comes up alongside the NHS, it comes up alongside the cost of living and inflation, and that's largely because of a concocted media scare around this issue. There's all the ways we used to have to get around this censorship, this monopoly narrative, are now being targeted. There was a fanciful idea, maybe not fanciful to begin with, sorry Tony, shut me up, I'm going on too long, but that when we had social media, it would get around all of the big control by a few big newspapers of public opinion and so on. Anybody can have a platform on social media. Of course, we've seen the opposite, that an even smaller number of gigantic companies control, to quote Vijay Prashad in a recent article, the information architecture of the entire world. They decide what you can see and so on, and since the war in Ukraine started, there's been an acceleration of censorship online, of taking down platforms which put forward different interpretations of events from those of our own government. And I think it's really important when we talk about pluralistic media to say, it's not about whether we necessarily agree with this platform or that platform. It is about saying that unless you have a range of different platforms and a range of different opinions, then what you're going to be spoon-fed all the time is the narrative of our ruling class and our state, and that is really, really dangerous, and it's happening all the time at the moment. So these corporations, Google, Facebook, Twitter, they are political, they do edit things politically. In Latin America, they've done it very, very obviously, shutting down left-wing accounts and blocking the accounts of people like the former Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa. We have a kind of move, supported by the Labour Party largely, to say, because of fake news online, because of enemy propaganda online, and because of online harms, which are a real issue when young people are kind of exposed to manipulative content and damaged by it, that we should increase corporate and state regulation, which is always an excuse for them to start editing things politically and censoring things politically. So that's the situation we're in. We've got a bit of a backlash at the moment, and it needs to succeed because this media censorship is not happening in isolation. It is part of the same anti-democratic drive which we're seeing from the Conservative Party in restricting our right to protest, our right to strike, our right to vote. We're seeing in the Labour Party in writing to branches saying you're not allowed to discuss this, you're not allowed to discuss that. If you say X, Y or Z, you're out of the party, those opinions are no longer allowed. It is a broad narrowing, is a terrible phrase. It is a systematic narrowing of what are the politically acceptable views to hold in Britain. I think there are some immediate political reasons why they're doing that now. The most prominent being the Jeremy Corbyn period, the fact that they suddenly realised there is a huge appetite for radical change in this country and they don't want that appetite to sort of arise again or develop again. There is, on a slightly longer term basis, a crisis of capitalism. It is more and more difficult for the British economic system to satisfy people's expectations of it. People's living standards are falling, our public services are getting worse, and our politicians are trying to manage decline and tell us we can't expect any more to have a decent pension when you retire, you can't expect any more to have an ambulance come within a certain time frame and so on. You just have to get used to all of this stuff. So, of course, the most kind of famous and possibly misused element of Gramsci's analysis was this idea that capitalist rule rests on a combination of coercion and consent. And if the consent of the British people has visibly declined for our political system, there are all kinds of indicators showing that it has, then the coercion has to be stepped up to make up for that, to keep the people who are in charge, and that's what we're seeing with the censorship, with all of this. And there's one final point, which is, I think, the most chilling of all, that our public opinion is now being primed for a drive to the Third World War. The second session in today is about stopping the Third World War, but you have US generals in the Far East saying we are going to have a war with China by 2025. We have Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, saying we are going to be in a full-scale war within the next 7 years. A war with Russia or China or both would be a catastrophe on a scale that very few people in this country can really imagine, in terms of the huge suffering it will inflict all over the world, but including here. And to actually get people to buy into a war like that, there needs to be a much narrower, an absolute crackdown on critical voices, sceptical voices about what our governments are up to. So I think that is another really important reason why we're here today, to say we need a workers' media. There are voices who are challenging this, but they are too small, as Crispin said. They don't get the range and the support that they do. The Morning Star, because it is owned and controlled by its readers, because of a set up as a co-op, means it cannot be brought out, and because of the trade unions who sit on its board, the 12 trade unions, and I think there's going to be a 13th, which I hope isn't unlucky, but we've had notification from the Union of Road Transport,
URTU,
the lorry drivers union, that they wish to join our board as well, which is fantastic news. But the Morning Star is a really Labour movement-rooted, broad-based newspaper, and that you can see in the panels that we have today. We can bring in a huge range of trade unionists, activists from different strands of the left, and be that daily voice for a different kind of future. So that's why it's really, really important that after a difficult few years with the pandemic and the defeat of the Jeremy Corbyn leadership and so on, that we do say this newspaper is as vital as it ever has been, and we do need to build it back and build sales and build support for the paper and the movement and more widely. So that's it from me. Unfortunately, I can't see Lucy yet, but we'll go into some questions and answers.
Yeah.
If she does arrive in time, we can always
Fit her in.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, good.